My students, I'm going to record today's lecture, or rather yesterday's lecture, and it's going to be about Samuel, Saul, and David. And then in a different lecture, I will give you more information about Solomon. Samuel is a very important transitional figure. He's a Nazarite like Samson. That means that he never cuts his hair to show his devotion to God. He eats pure kosher food. He does not drink alcohol. Furthermore, he is a priest. He was adopted by the priest Eli into the tribe of Levi. So he becomes part of Eli's family, and he is anointed a priest. He is the first prophet, because Moses, although called the prophet par excellence, meaning the greatest prophet, is really the great lawgiver of the law of the Torah. So Moses is in a category all by himself, and Samuel is purely a prophet. He's also the last of the judges and the one to anoint the first two kings of the nation of Israel. He hears the voice of God from the time he's a boy. Samuel replaces the priest of Bethel, Eli, whose sons are evil. Unfortunately, Samuel, although himself a very holy man and a very great leader, has sons who are also evil. They are also corrupt and immoral. And so the people will not accept the sons of Samuel after his death. Instead, they ask for a king to unify them. However, God tells Samuel to anoint Saul king, even though Samuel is upset and angry at the people. He thinks only God should be considered their king. Saul begins well as king. He is humble and a brave warrior. However, he is erratic. He is subject to fits of anger and depression. Saul also makes decisions that conflict with Samuel's directions from God. He performs sacrifices that should be performed only by a priest. Saul also does not carry out the ban against the Amalekites and their king Agag. Samuel confronts Saul, telling him that God has rejected him, and kills Agag. Later on, we're going to see the consequences of Saul's disobedience when a descendant of King Agag, called Haman, tries to kill the whole Jewish people. And Esther, who is of the tribe of Benjamin and a descendant of Saul's family, is able to save her people by pleading with the king. Meanwhile, in secret, Samuel anoints David as the next king. David is still a shepherd boy. David comes into Saul's service as a musician and armor bearer. He wins fame by slaying Goliath, a duty which should have been the king's. David becomes a very popular warrior and is loved by Jonathan, Saul's oldest son, and Michal, Saul's younger daughter. David marries Michal, but then has to flee for his life from Saul. Both Jonathan and Michal help David. Meanwhile, Saul gives Michal in marriage to another man, Paltiel. Saul pursues David, but David eludes him. At the same time, David remains faithful to Saul and does not kill or harm him, even when the opportunity to do so occurs twice. When Saul and his sons die in battle against the Philistines, David laments their death in a song at the beginning of the second book of Samuel. David comes to power as the next king of Judah. The house of David and the house of Saul fight. At the same time, Michal is returned to David. This is a political choice on David's part. Her husband, Paltiel, follows after her grieving, but is powerless to save her. Michal comes to hate David. Joab, David's general, murders Abner and Ishmael, Saul's general and Saul's son. This is done without David's knowledge, and David mourns. However, this effectively makes David king of all 12 tribes of Israel. David captures Jerusalem, a Jebusite city. He probably does this by entering through the city's underground water shaft. Jerusalem becomes his capital city. This seems to have happened with little bloodshed. The Jebusite king and people surrender to David and accept his rule, becoming part of Israel. They were a cultured people with much to offer, and they continue to live in Jerusalem. Some scholars, notably Dr. Karen Armstrong, believe the prophet Nathan, the priest Zadok, and Bathsheba may have been Jebusites. There may also have been a tension between the traditional Israelite leadership and the newly included Jebusite leadership. Some of David's champions, including Uriah the Hittite, Bathsheba's husband, were allies from other Canaanite nations. David moves the Ark of the Covenant from Bethel to Jerusalem. When David dances before the Ark, Michal expresses her scorn of David because he is dancing in his loincloth. A note of explanation: the loincloth was actually quite modest. The priest would wear a loincloth when giving sacrifice of animals before God. So they would wear trousers that covered the waist to the knees, and on top of that, the loincloth, which was like a kilt from the waist to the knees. So really, Michal's bitterness has to do with the separation from her beloved Paltiel. So David and Michal have nothing to do with each other after that. Michal remains in his house because she is a royal woman and a daughter of King Saul. She has no child, a tragedy to a woman of that time. David wishes to build a temple to house the Ark of the Covenant. However, the prophet Nathan tells him that it is not David who will build the temple, but his son. Instead, God assures David that his house, that is, his royal line of descendants, will endure forever. This is known as the Davidic covenant. Jews of later times saw this promise as God's announcement of a future Messiah, the Anointed One in Hebrew, of David's lineage, who would deliver the people from oppression. Christians interpret the Davidic covenant as fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Now you might say there's a lot of violence in these books, okay? These sacred scriptures are filled with battles, murder, deception, treason, adultery, incest. We really see a lot of horrible stuff going on. And we're asking ourselves, how are we to understand all these situations? Surely we're not expected to imitate the actions of these people who are both great saints and great sinners. Well, we probably want to see things through the mercy and the love and the justice of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We also want to look at things through the 13 attributes of God mentioned in Exodus 34. God is merciful, blessing goodness to endlessly. When it says 1,000 generations, that really means forever and ever, okay? And limiting the suffering to the innocent. But God will not take away our free will. And that is why these evil things happen. And they can happen in the greatest of the heroes, including King David. So abuse of the stranger. So we learn about in the Hebrew scriptures, we see the sanctity of sex and marriage. That sexual love is intended only in marriage between a man and a woman for life. By the time of the Deuteronomists, monogamy was really, if not promulgated by Mosaic law, it was the way people did live after the exile. Okay, so I would have to look in my historical documents to find out when exactly it was promulgated formally in Judaism. But marriage has always been holy. Okay, and sexual love has been understood as being in marriage. Period. So they condemn adultery, rape, and incest, abuse of the stranger, murder, and oppression of the defenseless poor, widow, and orphan are condemned also in Deuteronomy 27, that are known as the 12 curses. Okay? Adultery, rape, and murder are capital offenses. Now, this is the low point of David's life. There were other low points, but this is probably the lowest. Besides Michal, David now has 6 wives and 6 sons. After leading his troops in battle, David remains in Jerusalem. That's very unusual for him. Before that, he would be at the most dangerous point of the battle. So he stays home. Now, he's strolling on his rooftop one evening, probably the highest vantage point in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is built on many hills, and at that time the king's palace was probably the highest hill because the temple had not yet been built. Okay? So think of this. It's dark, and you don't expect the king to be home, and you have to bathe because it's the time. This is what Bathsheba is confronted with. It's her time of the month. She is obligated to bathe. It's a mikvah, okay? It's a ritual bath. It's not only to get yourself clean, but it's required by Jewish law. And there's no indoor plumbing. So either you bathe in a courtyard with very high walls or on your rooftop with partitions to, shield you from public view. And so the rabbis in their commentaries think that this is what happened, that she did not know the king was home. She did the best she could with her maidservants to shield her from public view because she probably had help getting bathed and cleaned up and dressed. But he spies her bathing, okay? And he misuses his power as king to bring Bathsheba to the palace and commits adultery. When Bathsheba becomes pregnant, David has her husband Uriah the Hittite killed. Then he marries Bathsheba. Uriah was a brave and principled man, one of David's mighty men, according to the first book of Chronicles. So the Bible presents Uriah in a very positive light, and it does not blame Bathsheba for what happened. It blames David. Nathan the prophet confronts David by telling a parable. David condemns the evil committed by the man in the parable, only to discover that he is that man. David repents. The consequences of David's actions are seen in the death of his first son by Bathsheba. The child dies shortly after birth. David and Bathsheba have 4 more sons. The oldest is Solomon. David's sins and crimes give a horrific example to his own children. David's firstborn son, Amnon, rapes his half-sister Tamar. When David does nothing, Tamar's full brother, Absalom, has Amnon killed. David loves Absalom and again does nothing. Absalom leads a rebellion against David, who flees Jerusalem. Joab, David's general, kills Absalom, and the rebellion is over. So the first book of Kings narrates David's last days in the reign of Solomon.